So just when it feels like the abolitionists are starting to get their way and slavery is losing its momentum and it's looking like the northern states are going to kind of get control of things and we might actually have the end of slavery in sight, then the Supreme Court gets involved. And the Dred Scott decision in 1857 ended up being a major step backwards in the anti-slavery movement, in the abolition movement. So let's take a look at what happened in this Supreme Court case. So Dred Scott was a slave, right? He was an enslaved person who lived with his owner in Missouri. And remember, Missouri was a slave state. But then they moved to Illinois, which was a free state, and then also to Wisconsin, which was a free territory. It wasn't a state yet, but it was still free territory. So slavery was illegal in both Illinois and the Wisconsin territory. And so Dred Scott told his master, you can't own me here. Slavery is illegal here, so you have to set me free. Well, Dred Scott sued his master. As a slave, he sued his master saying, you can't own me, you have to set me free. And so this court case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But at the time, the Supreme Court was stacked with Supreme Court justices who were pro-slavery. You see, in the Supreme Court, it kind of takes a lot of time for Supreme Court justices to move on. They either have to die or retire in order to lose their position, right? They can also be impeached, but we'll be talking about that in our next trimester together. And so the Supreme Court had a bunch of justices that were in favor of slavery still, right? Even though the rest of the country was kind of moving away from slavery, there were still some justices in place that were in favor of slavery. And so the court held that Dred Scott was not free because they said he was not considered a person under the Constitution. In fact, they said that all Black people, not just enslaved people, but all African Americans were not considered citizens, and therefore they couldn't sue in court because they don't have the rights that citizens do. So Dred Scott ended up losing his case because it was argued that he was not considered a person, he was considered property of his master. So as you can imagine, the northern states were really, really upset about this decision because it was a major step backward in their abolition movement. Meanwhile, the southern states were like, yeah, because it overturned some of the other decisions that were previously made, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So it's saying that that the government cannot decide if people get to own property or not. and slaves were considered property instead of people under this decision. So sadly, it was saying that it was unconstitutional for the government to decide if people could or could not own slaves. So what the Dred Scott decision did was it allowed slavery to continue even in the territories and states that had already said slavery is illegal here, no more slavery here. It meant you could move into that state with your slave and keep that slave if you wanted to. All right, take a moment and fill out your chart for the Dred Scott decision.